It happened at 11:34 a.m. on a Wednesday morning in March. It was the moment Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez realized she had been asked to do something she had managed to avoid for her entire 6-year political career. Math. Not the kind of math you do on Twitter, where you round everything to billionaires are bad and trillions of dollars are necessary. Not the kind of math where you cite studies you haven't read and throw around abstract figures that sound impressive in a 60-second TikTok video. This was actual math, the kind with a calculator, the kind where the numbers have to add up, the kind where you can't just say, "We'll make the rich pay for it," and get a standing ovation. The kind where someone sits across from you with a slight, polite smile and a southern drawl and says, "Show me," and actually means it. Senator John Kenedy of Louisiana sat across from her at the witness table. To the uninitiated, he looked like a character from a courtroom drama set in the 1950s. Rumpled suit, slightly crooked tie, reading glasses that looked like they had been sat on a few times. He looked like someone's kindly grandfather who had gotten lost on his way to a fishing hole. But that was the camouflage. Beneath the simple country lawyer act was a man who had studied at Oxford University as a Rhodes Scholar, a man who had spent decades as a state treasurer, a man who viewed a spreadsheet the way a shark views a seal. The Senate Budget Committee hearing room had gone completely silent. Not the respectful silence of careful attention, nor the anticipatory silence before a big speech. It was the uncomfortable, collective, breath-holding, can't-look-away silence of watching someone realize in real time that they are in way over their head, that they have been found out, that the emperor, in fact, has no clothes, just really good lighting and 4 million Twitter followers. But to understand how we got to this frozen second, where a $5 calculator became the most dangerous weapon in Washington, we need to rewind. Not far, just 45 minutes. Back to when Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez still thought this was going to be another win. The hearing began with the kind of energy usually reserved for rock concerts. The hallway outside the Dirksen Senate office building was packed with young activists. They wore T-shirts demanding climate justice and held handmade signs that security had made them leave at the door. They had been arriving since 6 a.m. to get seats. This was their champion. This was the woman who had taken on the Democratic establishment and won, the bartender-turned-congresswoman who spoke truth to power. When AOC entered the room, the cameras clicked in a frenzy. She was dressed for battle in her signature bold red blazer and gold hoop earrings. Her makeup was camera-ready, her posture perfect. She looked powerful. She looked like the future. Chairman Lindsey Graham banged the gavel to bring the room to order. "We are here today for a special hearing on economic aspects of climate policy proposals," he announced, specifically examining the costs, benefits, and feasibility of various legislative frameworks. He introduced AOC, and she began her opening statement. It was a masterclass in political rhetoric. For 20 minutes, she commanded the room. "Chairman Graham, Ranking Member Kenedy," she began, her voice passionate and urgent. "We are facing an existential crisis. The science is clear. The evidence is overwhelming. We have, at most, 12 years to fundamentally transform our economy or face catastrophic and irreversible climate change." She painted a vivid picture of the future, a vision of a green economy with millions of union jobs, clean air, and racial justice. She spoke about high-speed rail, about retrofitting every building in America, about a just transition for workers. "Critics say it costs too much," she declared, looking directly into the cameras. I say we can't afford not to do it. Critics say it's unrealistic. I say what's unrealistic is expecting our children to survive on a planet we've made uninhabitable. The gallery behind her nodded in unison. A few people wiped away tears. This was the AOC brand. Moral clarity, emotional resonance, and unshakable confidence. She finished her speech to a murmur of approval, even from some of the Democrats on the panel. She took a sip of water, looking satisfied. She had hit all her talking points. The clips would be viral by noon. Then the questioning began. The Democrats lobbed her softballs, allowing her to expand on her vision. A few Republicans asked skeptical questions about government overreach, which she parried easily with prepared lines about the urgency of the crisis. And then Chairman Graham said the words that changed everything. The chair recognizes the ranking member, Senator Kenedy from Louisiana, for 10 minutes. John Kenedy adjusted his microphone. He looked over his reading glasses at her, blinking slowly. He didn't look angry. He didn't look aggressive. He looked confused, in a polite, helpful sort of way. Representative Ocasio-Cortez, Kenedy drawled, his voice thick with the bayou. Thank you for that passionate testimony. Really, that was something. You clearly believe deeply in these proposals. I can see that. I respect that. AOC nodded, returning the smile. This seemed friendly enough. He was just another old white guy in a suit. She had handled dozens of them. Now, I'm just a simple country lawyer, Kenedy continued, leaning forward. So, I hope you'll forgive me if I ask some basic questions. I'm not as sophisticated as some of my colleagues here. I just need help understanding how some of these things work. It was the trap. It was the classic Kenedy setup. But AOC, blinded by the lights and her own confidence, walked right into it. She straightened her blazer, ready to educate the senator on the moral necessity of her plan. She didn't see the yellow legal pad in front of him, covered in handwritten numbers. She didn't see the trap door beneath her feet. Of course, Senator, she said, her voice dripping with benevolence. I'm happy to explain anything. Kenedy smiled. I appreciate that. Truly. He picked up a pen. Now, let's talk about the money. Senator Kenedy flipped the first page of his yellow legal pad. The sound was crisp in the quiet room. He didn't look up immediately. He seemed to be studying his own handwriting, as if double-checking a grocery list. You mentioned investing trillions of dollars in green infrastructure, Kenedy said, his voice maintaining that gentle, inquisitive tone. Now, I wrote down a few numbers while you were talking, but I want to make sure I got them right. Could you give me a ballpark figure? Roughly, how many trillions are we talking about? Over 10 years. AOC didn't hesitate. This was a standard question, one she had answered in dozens of interviews. Well, Senator, she replied confidently, estimates vary depending on the scope of implementation, but most serious analyses put the investment needs somewhere between $10 and $15 trillion over a 10-year period. Kenedy wrote this down slowly, speaking aloud as his pen moved across the paper. 10 to 15 trillion. Okay, so that's about $1 trillion to $1.5 trillion per year, give or take. Yes, roughly, AOC agreed. Obviously, the spending would ramp up over time as programs get implemented, but that's the general range. And where would that money come from? Kenedy looked up, peering over his spectacles. How would we pay for it? AOC launched into her standard answer, the one that played so well on cable news. We would implement a progressive tax system that asks the wealthiest Americans to pay their fair share. she said, her voice rising with moral authority. We would close corporate loopholes that let billion-dollar companies pay zero in federal taxes. And the investment itself would stimulate economic growth, generating additional tax revenue. Kenedy nodded along, acting as if this was all very enlightening. Okay, tax the wealthy. Close loopholes. I'm with you so far. He paused, tapping his pen on the pad. How much money would that raise per year? AOC shifted slightly in her seat. This was getting specific. Well, Senator, if we implement a marginal tax rate of 70% on income over $10 million combined with a wealth tax on fortunes over $50 million… Right, Kenedy interrupted gently. But how much revenue would that generate? Per year? Ballpark figure. I don't have the exact figure in front of me, AOC admitted, but economists have estimated it would raise several $100 billion annually. Kenedy kept writing. Several $100 billion. He looked up. Let's say $500 billion. Let's be generous with the estimate. Is that fair? That seems plausible, AOC said, though a flicker of uncertainty crossed her face. So, Kenedy said, doing the mental math out loud, we need about $1.5 trillion per year. We have $500 billion from taxing the rich. That leaves us about $1 trillion per year that we still need to come up with. Is that math correct? The room seemed to shrink. The gap between taxing the rich and the actual cost of the program was suddenly very visible, sitting there on the table between them. Well, Senator, AOC said quickly, there are other revenue sources we'd be tapping. Like what, specifically? Kenedy asked. Corporate tax reform, she listed. Closing the carried interest loophole. Eliminating fossil fuel subsidies. Kenedy held up a hand, palm out, stopping her. I understand there are multiple sources, Representative, but I'm trying to get to actual numbers. You mentioned a $1 trillion gap. What are the other revenue sources, and how much does each one generate? AOC glanced at her notes. They contained bullet points about justice and equity, but they didn't have spreadsheets. Her chief of staff in the audience shifted in his seat, his face tightening. Senator, AOC said, her voice stiffening, I think to give you precise figures, I'd need to consult the detailed Congressional Budget Office analyses. You don't have ballpark figures? Kenedy asked. The A.W. Shucks demeanor dropped just a fraction, revealing the sharp mind underneath. You're proposing to spend over $1 trillion a year, and you don't know roughly where it's all coming from? Senator, these are complex policy proposals, AOC argued, falling back on jargon. They require detailed economic modeling. The exact revenue figures depend on implementation details, growth assumptions, behavioral responses. Kenedy smiled again, but this time it didn't reach his eyes. Representative Ocasio-Cortez, with all due respect, I'm not asking for exact figures. I'm asking for rough estimates. You've spent 20 minutes telling us we need to spend $15 trillion. Surely, you have some idea of where that money comes from. The silence in the room deepened. The journalists were leaning forward, sensing blood in the water. Let me help, Kenedy said, reaching into a folder on his desk. I have here some documents from the Congressional Budget Office. These are nonpartisan career economists, folks who just crunch numbers regardless of who is in power. May I walk through some of these figures with you? AOC couldn't say no. Sure, Senator. Kenedy pulled out several printed pages and adjusted his glasses. The CBO analyzed various revenue proposals that have been suggested. Let's go through them one by one. First, your proposal for a 70% marginal rate on income over $10 million. He looked at the paper. The CBO estimates this would raise approximately $43 billion per year. He looked up at her. Does that number surprise you? AOC blinked. That seems low. Well, Kenedy drawled, there are only about 16,000 households in America earning over $10 million a year. Even at a 70% rate, you run into some mathematical limits. Do you dispute the CBO's calculation? I'd need to see their full methodology, AOC deflected. Fair enough, Kenedy said. Let's say they're wrong. Let's say they're off by 100%. Let's double it. Call it $90 billion per year. We still need about $1.4 trillion more. What else? He flipped the page. Wealth tax, Kenedy read. Senator Warren has proposed a 2% annual tax on wealth over $50 million. Treasury Department estimates suggest this would raise somewhere between $200 and $300 billion per year. That assumes no capital flight and perfect compliance, neither of which has ever happened in human history. But let's be optimistic. Let's call it $275 billion. He wrote it down. So we're at about $365 billion total now from those two proposals, Kenedy summarized. That leaves $1.1 trillion per year unaccounted for. Shall we continue? For the next 10 minutes, Kenedy methodically went through every single revenue proposal associated with the Green New Deal. Corporate tax increases, closing loopholes, carbon taxes, financial transaction taxes. He had the CBO numbers for all of them. He walked through each one patiently, politely asking AOC if she agreed with the figures or if she had different ones. She couldn't answer, because she didn't have numbers. She had slogans, and slogans don't fit in a calculator. So, if I add all of these up, Kenedy said, running his finger down the long list on his legal pad, we get to maybe $600 billion per year in new revenue. Maximum. Best case scenario. He peered at her. And your spending proposal is $1.5 trillion per year. That is a shortfall of $900 billion per year. For 10 years. That is $9 trillion in new deficit spending, Kenedy said. Is my math wrong anywhere? AOC was no longer smiling. Her red blazer seemed less like armor and more like a target. Senator, she said, her voice tight, I think you're not accounting for the economic growth that would result from these investments. How much growth? Kenedy asked instantly. What is your assumption? Studies show that green infrastructure investment has high multiplier effects, she said, repeating a talking point. How much, specifically? Kenedy pressed. What growth rate are you assuming? And what additional tax revenue does that generate? I don't have those exact projections in front of me, she admitted quietly. Kenedy reached into his briefcase. He pulled out a small gray object. It was a simple calculator, the kind with big plastic buttons. He slid it across the polished wood table until it rested directly in front of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Representative, Kenedy said softly, would you do me a favor? Would you mind adding up those revenue sources we just discussed? Just the ones you've mentioned. See what the total comes to. The room froze. It was the calculator moment. 11:34 a.m. The moment math stopped being a concept and became a verdict. The calculator sat on the mahogany table like an unexploded ordnance. It was gray, plastic, and cheap, the kind you buy in a frantic last-minute stop for school supplies. In the opulent setting of the Senate hearing room, surrounded by marble and history, it looked absurd. But as Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez reached for it, the room went so quiet you could hear the air conditioning hum in the ceiling vents. Her hand, usually so expressive when she was live streaming to her millions of followers, trembled slightly. This was the moment. 11:34 a.m. The viral clip that would define the hearing was being recorded in real time. $90 billion from the income tax, she whispered, keying in the numbers. Her fingernails clicked against the plastic buttons. $275 billion from the wealth tax, she muttered. Click, click, click. $120 billion from corporate tax increases, she added. $80 billion from closing loopholes. $40 billion from carbon taxes. She hesitated. She looked at her notes, hoping to find a hidden cache of trillions she had missed. There was nothing. Just bullet points about equity and justice. She hit the equals button. $605 billion, she said softly. Kenedy nodded slowly, his face unreadable. And your annual spending proposal? 1 to 1.5 trillion, she answered, her voice barely carrying to the microphone. So, Kenedy drawled, leaning back in his chair, we are short about $400 to $900 billion per year. That is $4 to $9 trillion over 10 years, on top of our existing deficits. Is that math correct? AOC set down the calculator. She took a sip of water, her eyes darting to her staff in the gallery. They looked terrified. Senator, she said, trying to regain her footing, I believe that economic models that don't account for the costs of inaction on climate change are fundamentally incomplete. I'm not asking about the costs of inaction, Kenedy said gently. I'm asking about the costs of your specific proposal and where the money comes from. Can you answer that question? The silence that followed was excruciating. It stretched for 10 seconds, then 20. I would need to work with budget analysts to develop a comprehensive financing plan, she finally admitted. Kenedy let that hang there. He didn't gloat. He didn't smirk. He just let the admission sit in the center of the room. So, he said, you have been advocating for this policy for 6 years. You have introduced legislation. You have given hundreds of speeches. You have written op-eds. But you haven't actually worked out how to pay for it? Senator, I think you are oversimplifying, she snapped, a flash of her usual defiance returning. I'm doing arithmetic, Kenedy replied. Simple arithmetic. Addition and subtraction. Am I doing the arithmetic wrong? She had no answer, because he wasn't doing it wrong. The numbers were the numbers. Kenedy wasn't done. He flipped to a new page on his legal pad, the sound of the paper tearing slightly in the hush. Let's talk about modern monetary theory, Kenedy said. You have cited MMT multiple times in interviews as the justification for why deficits don't matter. Is that right? AOC nodded, looking relieved. Theory was better than math. Theory was abstract. Yes, Senator. MMT suggests that sovereign nations with their own currency have more fiscal flexibility than traditional economics suggests. Can you explain how it works? Kenedy asked. Specifically, how does MMT prevent hyperinflation if you just print money? This was the second trap. AOC launched into a stumbling explanation about government creating money and resources being the only constraint. Kenedy listened patiently, then interjected. So, if I understand you correctly, the government prints money to pay for things, and if inflation starts to rise, the mechanism to stop it is… What? Taxation, AOC said. Exactly, Kenedy beamed. Taxation. You have to tax money out of the economy to cool it down. So, under your theory, if your spending causes inflation, you would need to raise taxes on the middle class to stop it. Is that correct? No, I'm not proposing middle-class tax increases, she insisted. Then, how do you stop the inflation? Kenedy asked, his brow furrowed in mock confusion. If you can't raise enough taxes from the rich, as we just proved with the calculator, and you won't tax the middle class, under your own theory, you have no brakes on the car. You just drive off the cliff of hyperinflation. AOC stared at him. She realized too late that he had read the theory better than she had. "Senator," she said, her voice tight, "the economic growth from the investment would—" "How much growth?" Kenedy interrupted. "What growth rate prevents inflation when you are running 11% deficits? Is it 5%, 8%, 12%? She didn't have a number. She never had a number. "Representative Ocasio-Cortez," Kenedy said, his voice dropping to a whisper, "let me ask you the simplest possible question. Where does the money come from? Not theory, not moral frameworks, actual dollars. Where do they come from?" The silence returned, heavier than before. "Senator," she said, defeated, "I think these are complex questions that require detailed modeling." "No, ma'am," Kenedy said firmly. "These are simple arithmetic questions, and if you can't answer them, maybe the proposal isn't ready. Maybe it's not a serious policy. Maybe it's just a slogan." Kenedy glanced at the clock. He had 4 minutes left. He hadn't rushed. He hadn't raised his voice. He had simply methodically dismantled the economic foundation of the most famous policy proposal in modern democratic history. "Let's shift gears," Kenedy said, turning the page. "Let's talk about job creation. You mentioned this program would create millions of jobs. How many millions?" AOC sat up straighter. Jobs. This was safe terrain. This was about people, about dignity. "Estimates range from 10 to 20 million jobs over 10 years, she said, her confidence flickering back to life. "Let's use 20 million to be generous," Kenedy said. "That's 2 million jobs per year. And we established the cost is $1.5 trillion per year." He picked up the calculator again. He didn't slide it to her this time. He did the math himself, holding it up so the cameras could see the display. 1.5 trillion divided by 2 million, Kenedy muttered. "You know what that works out to per job?" He turned the calculator around. $750,000, Kenedy read. "Per job, per year." He looked at her over his reading glasses. "Now, the median American worker earns about $54,000 per year. We could literally just pay them their salary directly for 14 years with the amount of money you are spending to create one job. Why don't we just do that instead? Cut out the middleman." AOC shifted in her seat. "Senator, those aren't just any jobs. These are good-paying green jobs in growth industries." "How much do they pay?" Kenedy asked. "Prevailing wage, union scale," she answered. "Ballpark, $60,000 to $70,000. "Right," Kenedy said. "So we are spending $750,000 of taxpayer money to create a job that pays $70,000. That is a 10-to-1 ratio. Representative, if I went to my bank in Louisiana and said I wanted to invest $10 to make $1, they would send me to a psychiatrist." "Would you invest your own money in something with those numbers?" he asked. "Senator, you are only looking at the direct job creation," she argued. "There are multiplier effects." "I understand multipliers," Kenedy said dryly. "I was a state treasurer. Even with the most generous multiplier assumptions in the world, the math doesn't work. It's bleeding cash." He pulled out another document, this one featuring a picture of a suburban home with solar panels on the roof. "Let's get specific," Kenedy said. "You have specifically advocated for massive solar panel deployment. Residential solar. You want everyone to have it." "Yes," AOC said. "It empowers homeowners and reduces reliance on the grid." "Do you know how much a typical residential solar installation costs?" Kenedy asked. "It varies," she said carefully, "but federal subsidies help." "Before subsidies," Kenedy corrected, "because the taxpayer pays for the subsidies. How much does the hardware and labor cost?" "Maybe $20,000 to $30,000, she guessed. "Let's call it $25,000. Kenedy agreed. And how much does it save on electricity costs per year? Depends on the sun, she said. Average, Kenedy pressed. Ballpark, maybe $1,200 to $2,500? That sounds right, she admitted. So that is a 17-year payback period, Kenedy noted. But solar panels degrade. They need maintenance. But let's put the money aside. Let's look at the carbon. That's the point, right? Exactly, AOC said. The environmental benefit is the primary consideration. How much carbon does a typical residential solar installation offset per year? AOC didn't have the number. Kenedy did. According to the EPA, he read, about 4 tons of CO2 equivalent per year for an average residential system. Now, you have said we need to reduce U.S. emissions by about 2 billion tons per year to meet your targets. Is that right? Roughly, yes. Kenedy did the division on the legal pad. So, if each residential installation offsets 4 tons, we would need to install solar panels on 500 million houses to hit your target from residential solar alone. He paused. How many houses exist in America, Representative? She stared at him. She knew where this was going. She knew she didn't have the answer. I would need to check the census data. About 140 million, Kenedy said. So, we would need to put solar panels on every single house in America. 3.5 times. He leaned forward. We physically don't have enough roofs. Even if we had the money, which we don't have the houses. Does that number surprise you? Senator, AOC stammered, obviously residential solar is just one part of a broader strategy. I understand, Kenedy said. But you used it as an example. I am just doing the math on your own example. And the math tells me that your plan requires 3 Americas to work. He let the absurdity of it sink in. 500 million roofs in a country with 140 million homes. A 10-to-1 cost ratio on jobs. A $9 trillion deficit. Representative Ocasio-Cortez, Kenedy said, his voice losing its inquisitiveness and settling into a somber realization. I am not questioning your heart, but I am questioning your calculator. Because right now, it seems like you are trying to buy a Ferrari with a piggy bank. The hearing room felt smaller now, the air thin and claustrophobic. The grand vision of a green utopia that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had painted in her opening remarks was being systematically dismantled, brick by brick, number by number. She sat at the witness table, her posture still rigid, but the confidence in her eyes had been replaced by a wary defensiveness. She watched Senator Kenedy flip the page on his yellow legal pad, dreading what might be written there. Let's shift our gaze across the pond, Kenedy said, his voice taking on a leisurely, conversational tone. You have mentioned European countries as models for your proposals. You've pointed to Germany's energy transition. You've praised the Scandinavian countries, Denmark, Sweden, as beacons of democratic socialism. Is that right? AOC nodded, relieved to be moving away from the calculator. This was safer ground, philosophy, ideology. Yes, Senator. These countries have shown that we can transition to renewable energy while maintaining a high quality of life. They prove that a robust social safety net and environmental responsibility are compatible with a modern economy. Oh, I'm so glad you brought that up, Kenedy beamed, his face lighting up like a kid on Christmas morning. He reached down and pulled out a thick blue folder. It looked like he had been waiting all morning just for her to say the word Europe. Let's talk about Germany first, Kenedy said. The Energiewende, their energy transition. You are familiar with it generally? Yes, she said. Germany has spent over 500 billion euros on renewable energy since the year 2000, Kenedy noted, consulting a chart. That's about $600 billion. They have installed massive amounts of solar and wind. They are held up as the gold standard. He looked up. Do you know what happened to their electricity prices? AOC hesitated. I believe they have fluctuated. They skyrocketed, Kenedy corrected gently. German households now pay about 40 cents per kilowatt hour. Do you know what Americans pay? About 16 cents. Their electricity is nearly 3 times more expensive than ours. It is so expensive that German heavy industry, steel, chemicals, manufacturing, is shutting down or moving to China because they can't afford to keep the lights on. But they are reducing emissions, AOC countered. Are they? Kenedy asked. Actually, their emissions have barely budged in 10 years. Why? Because while they were building windmills, they shut down their nuclear power plants. And to keep the grid from collapsing when the sun doesn't shine, do you know what they are burning? Natural gas, AOC guessed. Lignite coal, Kenedy said, the word landing with a thud. The dirtiest coal on the planet. They are demolishing ancient villages to mine brown coal because they did the math wrong on renewables. Is that the model you are recommending we follow? Bankrupting our manufacturers to burn dirty coal? AOC tried to pivot. Germany is a specific case, Senator. But the Scandinavian countries have successfully implemented— Yes, Scandinavia, Kenedy interrupted, flipping a page. Let's talk about Denmark. Beautiful country. I've been there. Great pastries. You have held them up as a model of how to pay for things, Kenedy said. Free health care, free college, robust services. And you say we pay for it by taxing the rich, correct? Correct, she said. The wealthy should pay their fair share. Do you know what Denmark's top marginal income tax rate is? Kenedy asked. It is high, she said. Around 55% or 60%. It is 56%, Kenedy confirmed. But here is the question, Representative. Do you know what income level that tax rate kicks in at? AOC paused. I assume it is for high earners. In America, our top rate kicks in at about $600,000, Kenedy explained. You proposed a new tax for people making $10 million. In Denmark, that 56% tax rate kicks in at $60,000. The number hung in the air. That's right, Kenedy said. The school teacher, the truck driver, the manager at the grocery store. In Denmark, they hand over more than half their paycheck to the government. Is that what you are proposing for American workers? Are you running on a platform of taxing the middle class at 56%? Senator, that is taking the tax structure out of context, she argued. How so? Kenedy asked. That is their actual tax code. I am reading from the Danish Tax Authority's website, and that's just income tax. They also have a 25% value-added tax. That's a sales tax on everything: food, clothes, gas. He looked at her over his glasses. A 25% sales tax hits poor people the hardest. Are you proposing we do that here? The Danish system provides services that reduce the cost of living, AOC insisted. They don't pay for health care. True, Kenedy agreed. But a beer in Copenhagen costs $12. A sandwich at lunch costs $18. Their cost of living is 70% higher than Louisiana. You can have free health care, or you can have disposable income. You can't have both. He flipped to the final page of the European folder. And Sweden, Kenedy said. You mentioned wealth taxes. Sweden tried a wealth tax, actually implemented it. Do you know what happened? They generate significant revenue, she ventured. They repealed it, Kenedy said. In 2007, because it caused capital flight. The founder of IKEA moved to Switzerland. The pharmaceutical money moved to London. The government lost more in income tax revenue from rich people leaving than they gained from the wealth tax itself. They did a study, Kenedy said, holding up a report with a Swedish flag on the cover. For every dollar raised by the wealth tax, they lost about $2 in other economic activity. That is why a socialist country got rid of it. Are you familiar with the Laffer curve, Representative? Kenedy asked. I am familiar with the theory, she said dismissively. It is often used to justify tax cuts for the rich. It is a principle that says, if you tax something at 100%, you get zero revenue because nobody works, Kenedy said. Sweden found out they were on the wrong side of the curve. You are proposing we do the exact same thing they admitted was a mistake. So, Kenedy concluded, closing the blue folder. Germany is burning coal. Denmark taxes the middle class at 56%. Sweden repealed the wealth tax because it didn't work. Which part of that model, specifically, do you want to import to America? AOC sat silently, her mouth a tight line. She had built her political identity on these countries being utopias. She had never expected someone to actually read their tax codes. Senator Kenedy glanced at the digital clock on the wall. He had 2 minutes remaining. He had dismantled the math. He had dismantled the theory. He had dismantled the international models. Now, he was going to bring it home. Let's bring this back to the United States, Kenedy said. In fact, let's bring it right to your front door. New York's 14th Congressional District. AOC stiffened. My district is not on trial here, Senator. No, but your judgment is, Kenedy replied evenly. You have represented the Bronx and Queens for 6 years now. Working-class neighborhoods, immigrants, people trying to make it. He pulled out a document that wasn't a spreadsheet. It was a press release. In 2018, Kenedy said, Amazon announced plans to build a second headquarters, HQ2, in Long Island City. That is right in your backyard. They promised 25,000 jobs. The average salary for those jobs was $150,000. Kenedy did the mental math for the room. 25,000 times $150,000. That is $3.7 billion in annual wages, going directly into the pockets of New Yorkers. That is $3.7 billion that gets spent at delis, at dry cleaners, at rent, at mortgages. It was the biggest economic development deal in the history of the city. He looked at her. The state and city offered about $3 billion in tax incentives over 10 years. That is $300 million per year, in exchange for $3.7 billion in wages. That is a 12-to-1 return on investment, Kenedy noted. Most investors would take that deal in a heartbeat. Most governors would kill for that deal. You led the opposition to that deal, Kenedy said. You called it corporate welfare. You said the jobs weren't real. You said we should take that $3 billion and spend it on subways and schools. Amazon pulled out, Kenedy said. They went to Virginia instead. He paused, leaning forward. Representative, do you know how tax incentives work? I understand that giving money to Jeff Bezos is not a priority for my constituents, she shot back, finding her footing on the anti-corporate rhetoric. But we weren't giving him money, Kenedy corrected gently. We were giving him a discount on future taxes. He would only pay if he came. When he didn't come, we didn't save $3 billion. We got zero. We have $0 for the subways, Kenedy said. $0 for the schools, and 0 jobs. How many of those 25,000 jobs have been created in your district since then? Kenedy asked. Silence. I'll tell you, Kenedy said, reading from a New York State Department of Labor report. About 2,800 jobs have been added in that sector in your district since Amazon pulled out. In Virginia, where Amazon went, they have hired 8,000 people already, and construction is booming. You turned down 25,000 jobs, Kenedy repeated. Can you explain that decision to your constituents? Senator, those jobs would have displaced people, AOC argued. Gentrification is a real threat. We need development that serves the community, not just shareholders. Let's look at your community, Kenedy said. What is the poverty rate in your district? I would need to check the most recent data, she deflected. It is 18.4%, Kenedy said. That is significantly higher than the national average of 11.5%. What is the unemployment rate in your district? She didn't answer. 7.1%, Kenedy read. The national average is 4.1%. You represent one of the poorest congressional districts in New York City. You have one of the highest unemployment rates. And you personally led the fight to kill 25,000 jobs that paid 6 figures. Kenedy took off his reading glasses and folded them on the table. He looked at her not as a senator to a representative, but as a man looking at a tragedy. Help me understand the logic, he said softly. You want to spend trillions of dollars we don't have to create government jobs that cost $750,000 apiece. But when private industry offers you 25,000 jobs for free, you say no. Ma'am, Kenedy said, I am not questioning your motives. I assume you want to help people, but I am questioning your math. Because your constituents can't eat victory against Amazon. They can't pay rent with fighting corporate power. They need jobs. They need wages. They need opportunity. The red light on the timer blinked. Kennedy's 10 minutes were up. My time has expired, Kenedy said. He pushed the calculator slightly toward the center of the table, a final, silent offering. Representative Ocasio-Cortez, thank you for being here. But I hope, the next time you propose a revolution, you bring a calculator. He sat back. The room didn't move. For a solid 5 seconds, nobody breathed. AOC sat frozen, the calculator staring back at her, the ghost of 25,000 jobs hovering in the air, and the realization dawning that the simple country lawyer had just ended her era of unchecked rhetoric. Thank you, Senator, Chairman Graham said, breaking the spell. We will take a 5-minute recess. AOC stood up quickly, ignoring the press, and huddled with her staff. But it was too late. The clips were already online. The math was already out there. And for the first time in her career, the numbers were shouting louder than she was. The hearing ended at 12:15 p.m., but the digital execution had happened 30 minutes prior. When Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez walked out of the Dirksen Senate office building, flanked by her usual entourage of aides and security, she tried to project her signature confidence. She waved to the few remaining supporters who had stuck around, forced a smile for the paparazzi, and ducked into her waiting SUV. But inside the vehicle, the air was suffocating. Her chief of staff, usually glued to his phone with the manic energy of a political operative, sat staring at his screen in silence. He didn't need to say a word. The notifications were vibrating the phone against his palm like a warning buzzer that wouldn't stop. The viral ecosystem, the very machine that AOC had built her career on, the weapon she had wielded so effectively against the boomers of the establishment, had turned on its creator. The calculator moment hit the internet with the force of a tidal wave. Within 60 minutes, the clip of her trembling hand punching numbers into the $5 device had 45 million views across platforms. It wasn't just trending, it was consuming the entire news cycle. On Twitter, "Ya Show Your Math" was the #1 trend worldwide. Kenedy Questions was #2. AOC Math was #3. The memes were instant, brutal, and impossible to contain. One side-by-side image showed AOC confidently lecturing the committee in her opening statement, next to a still frame of her staring blankly at the calculator. The caption read, "How it started versus how it's going." Another popular TikTok used the audio of Kenedy asking, "Is that math correct?" over videos of people realizing they had overdrawn their bank accounts. Conservative media was taking a victory lap the size of the Indianapolis 500. Fox News cut into their afternoon programming to replay the exchange in its entirety. "Kenedy destroys socialism with basic math," the Chiron screamed in bold red letters. They brought on economists, math teachers, and small business owners to dissect the footage. For the right, this was vindication, proof that the progressive movement was built on vibes, not substance. But the reaction that truly damaged her didn't come from her enemies. It came from her allies. MSNBC and CNN, usually reliable safe harbors for the squad, struggled to spin the disaster. Kennedy's questions missed the moral urgency of climate action. One anchor tried to argue, but he sounded unconvinced even to himself. When they played the clips, the panelists shifted uncomfortably in their seats. You couldn't spin arithmetic. You couldn't frame addition and subtraction as a right-wing conspiracy. Then came the intellectual abandonment. Paul Krugman, the Nobel Prize-winning economist and progressive icon who had often defended the spirit of the Green New Deal, wrote a column that afternoon titled, "Good Intentions Are Not a Balance Sheet." While he praised her passion, his conclusion was a devastating critique of her preparation. "If you are going to propose restructuring 20% of the American economy," Krugman wrote, "you owe it to the public to know the cost." Senator Kenedy exposed a fundamental unseriousness in how the modern left approaches policy. You cannot slogan your way through a budget. The Roosevelt Institute, a progressive think tank that had helped draft some of the initial Green New Deal language, released a statement that evening. It didn't mention AOC by name, but the subtext was screaming. "We remain committed to bold climate action," the statement read, "but we recognize that all policy proposals must be grounded in rigorous economic modeling and realistic financing mechanisms. We look forward to releasing a detailed funding framework next month." Translation: She doesn't speak for us anymore. We do the math. Even Bernie Sanders, her mentor and political father figure, went silent. His office released a one-sentence statement reaffirming his commitment to climate justice. There was no defense of AOC. There was no attack on Kenedy. Just silence. In Washington, silence from your allies is louder than shouting from your enemies. By 8 p.m., AOC's team tried to stop the bleeding. They released a 32-paragraph statement on Medium. It was dense, filled with academic jargon about fiscal multipliers and sovereign currency dynamics. It accused Kenedy of pedantic obstructionism and bad faith interrogation. But it landed with a thud. The internet didn't want a 3,000-word essay on monetary theory. They had seen the video. They had seen the calculator. They had seen the panic in her eyes. The narrative had shifted permanently. For 6 years, AOC had been the clapback queen, the woman who could destroy a critic with a single tweet. But you can't clap back at a calculator. You can't ratio a deficit. The Kenedy questions: what does it cost? Where does the money come from? What are the results? Had pierced the armor of her celebrity. As night fell over Washington, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez sat in her apartment, watching the cable news segments replay her humiliation on a loop. The aura of invincibility was gone. She was no longer the fresh face of the future. She was the student who hadn't done her homework. If the hearing was the earthquake, the aftershocks in New York's 14th congressional district were the tsunami that followed. For years, AOC's hold on her district had seemed unshakable. She was a celebrity, a national icon, a symbol of the Bronx's rising power. Her constituents famously ignored the attacks from Fox News, viewing them as badges of honor. But the calculator hearing hit differently. This wasn't an attack on her culture or her background. It was an exposure of her competence. 2 months after the hearing, a poll commissioned by the New York Daily News dropped a bombshell. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez approval rating, NY14. Before hearing, 68%. After hearing, 49%. For the first time in her career, she was underwater with her own voters. The breakdown was even worse. Only 32% of respondents believed she understands economics well enough to craft effective policy. A staggering 61% agreed with the statement that she needs more experience before proposing major legislation. The Bronx is a working-class borough. Its residents drive trucks, teach school, run bodegas, and nurse the sick. They understand math. They have to balance their own budgets every week. When they watched their representative unable to explain where $900 billion was coming from, they didn't see a visionary. They saw a risk. Sensing blood in the water, a challenger emerged. Marcus Rodriguez was everything AOC was not. Born in Queens, he was a former financial analyst who had left Wall Street to work in community banking, helping small businesses in the district get loans. He was boring. He wore ill-fitting suits. He had 400 Twitter followers, but he had a slogan that resonated perfectly with the moment. Do your homework. His campaign announcement video didn't feature dramatic music or slow-motion shots of him walking through the neighborhood. It opened with a clip of AOC staring at the calculator. "I love this district," Rodriguez said to the camera, standing in front of a closed storefront that used to be a bakery. "But we need representatives who understand that good intentions don't pay the rent." Senator Kenedy asked basic questions. Our congresswoman couldn't answer them. "I can." Rodriguez raised $400,000 in small-dollar donations in his first week. It wasn't corporate money. It was money from disillusioned Democrats who wanted serious governance. The campaign trail was brutal. AOC tried to rally her base with high-energy events, bringing in celebrities and national figures. But at every town hall, the questions were different now. "Representative," a union carpenter asked at a rally in Astoria, "you turned down the Amazon jobs because the math didn't work. But Senator Kenedy said the math was a 12-to-1 return. Can you explain that?" "Representative," a grandmother asked in Parkchester, "my grandson wants to be an engineer. He says your solar plan requires more roofs than we have houses. Is he right?" She couldn't dismiss them as trolls. These were her people. And they were asking the Kenedy questions. Meanwhile, back in Washington, the Green New Deal was quietly dying a bureaucratic death. The Congressional Progressive Caucus, reading the tea leaves, shelved their plans to force a floor vote on the resolution. "We are entering a phase of strategic refinement," the caucus chair told reporters, struggling to find a euphemism for retreat. "We are going back to the drawing board to develop robust financing mechanisms." It was a total capitulation. The Kenedy effect had made the original proposal toxic. No moderate Democrat wanted to be seen anywhere near a policy that couldn't pass a basic math test. The Green New Deal brand, once a badge of honor, was now a political albatross. Election day for the Democratic primary arrived on a humid Tuesday in June. Usually, AOC won her primaries with 70% or 80% of the vote. As the returns trickled in, the cable news anchors looked shocked. At 9:00 p.m., the race was too close to call. At 10 p.m., Rodriguez was leading by 200 votes. At 11 p.m., the absentee ballots from the gentrifying neighborhoods in Queens pushed AOC ahead. Final result? Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, 52%. Marcus Rodriguez, 48%. She had survived. But it was a Pyrrhic victory, a 26-point drop in support in 2 years. She had spent $12 million to beat a guy who spent $500,000. Her victory speech was subdued. There was no dancing. There were no declarations of a new era. She spoke briefly about continuing the fight and listening to the concerns of the community. She looked tired. She looked humbled. The message from the voters was clear. You can stay, but you better start doing the work. AOC returned to Washington a different politician. The firebrand who chased senators down hallways was gone. In her place was a legislator who hired 3 new economists for her staff. She began sitting through boring committee hearings without checking her phone. She started introducing smaller, targeted bills with fully funded pay-fors. She had learned the lesson. It had taken a public humiliation, a primary scare, and a $5 calculator. But she had learned it. Math is real. Numbers don't care about your politics. And if you want to change the world, you have to be able to pay for it. The fallout from the calculator hearing didn't just stay on the internet. It bled into the streets of New York's 14th congressional district. The political ground beneath Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, once thought to be solid granite, had turned into shifting sand. 2 months after the hearing, the New York Daily News released a poll that sent shockwaves through the Democratic establishment. For the first time in her incumbency, AOC's approval rating had dipped below 50% in her own district. The breakdown was specific and damning. While her favorability remained high among college-educated transplants in gentrifying neighborhoods, her support had cratered among older working-class residents and union households in the Bronx. These were voters who balanced checkbooks at kitchen tables, who understood debt, and who saw the inability to answer a basic budget question not as a quirky gaffe, but as a disqualifying lack of competence. Sensing this vulnerability, a primary challenger emerged from the woodwork. Marcus Rodriguez was not a media darling. He was a 42-year-old former community banker and school board member from Queens. He drove a 10-year-old Ford, wore suits that were clearly off the rack, and had a Twitter following of less than 500. He was boring. But in the wake of the viral hearing, boring suddenly looked like competent. His campaign slogan was simple, brutal, and effective. Do the math. Rodriguez didn't run attack ads calling AOC a socialist or a radical. He didn't need to. He simply ran the clip. His television spots were 30 seconds of Senator Kenedy asking, "Is that math correct?" followed by AOC's silence, and then a voiceover. "We can't afford empty promises. We need real plans." The primary campaign was a slugfest. AOC, realizing she was in the fight of her political life, deployed her massive fundraising war chest. She flooded the district with mailers, brought in celebrity endorsements, and held high-energy rallies in parks. But the energy had shifted. At town halls, the questions weren't about the moral arc of the universe anymore. Congresswoman, a retired transit worker, stood up and asked at a tense meeting in Jackson Heights, "Senator Kenedy said your plan would cost $750,000 per job. My son needs a job, but we don't have that kind of money. Was the senator lying, or did you not know the numbers?" AOC tried to pivot. "That was a bad faith argument designed to protect fossil fuel interests," she said, her voice rising. "But was the math right?" the man pressed. "Because I did the division on my phone, and it looked right to me." She couldn't escape it. The Kenedy questions, Cost, revenue, results, haunted every stop. Meanwhile, back in Washington, the Green New Deal resolution was quietly suffering a bureaucratic death. The Congressional Progressive Caucus, reading the tea leaves, realized that forcing a vote on the current version would be a political suicide mission for vulnerable Democrats in swing districts. "We are entering a phase of strategic refinement," the caucus chair told reporters, a polite euphemism for "we are burying this." "We are working with economists to develop robust financing mechanisms for future legislation." It was a total capitulation. The proposal that had launched a movement was effectively shelved because its primary spokesperson hadn't done the homework. Election Day arrived on a humid Tuesday in June. The turnout was massive. In 2018, AOC had won because nobody showed up to vote for the incumbent. In 2024, everyone showed up. As the returns trickled in, the cable news anchors were stunned. The race was neck and neck. The invincible incumbent was fighting for survival in precincts she used to carry by 40 points. At 10 p.m., Marcus Rodriguez was actually leading by 400 votes. At 11:30 p.m., the absentee ballots from Astoria, AOC's stronghold of young ideological voters, began to be counted. The final result was a nail-biter. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, 52.3%. Marcus Rodriguez, 47.7%. She had won. But it was a Pyrrhic victory, a 26-point drop in support in 2 years. She had spent $12 million to barely fend off a guy who spent $500,000 and used a calculator as a prop. Her victory speech that night was subdued. There was no dancing. There were no bold proclamations about taking over the party. She looked tired. She looked humbled. She spoke briefly about continuing the work and listening to the concerns of the community regarding fiscal responsibility. The voters had sent a message loud and clear: you can stay, but you better start bringing a calculator. AOC returned to Washington a changed politician. The firebrand who chased senators down hallways with an iPhone was gone. In her place was a legislator who quietly hired 3 senior economists for her staff. She began sitting through boring budget committee hearings without checking her phone. She started introducing smaller, targeted bills with fully funded pay-fors attached. She had survived the math test, but only barely, and she knew that next time there would be no curve. 1 year later, Senator John Kenedy stood at a podium in the auditorium of the LSU Law Center in Baton Rouge. The room was packed with law students, faculty, and aspiring politicians. He was there to give a guest lecture on constitutional law. But inevitably, during the Q&A, a student raised their hand and asked about the hearing. "Senator," the young woman asked, "did you feel bad making Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez look unprepared?" "Some people said it was mean." Kenedy smiled that slight, crinkly smile. He adjusted his rumpled jacket and leaned into the microphone. "I didn't make her look anything," Kenedy said, his drawl echoing in the hall. "I asked her questions about proposals she had been advocating for 6 years. If she wasn't prepared to answer them, that's not on me. That's on her." He paused, looking out at the sea of faces. "Look, I know I come across as this folksy country lawyer. People underestimate me because of the accent and the cheap suit. That's fine. I like being underestimated. But I went to Oxford. I was a state treasurer for decades. I understand economics. I understand budgets. And I understand that numbers matter. When someone proposes to spend $1.5 trillion a year," Kenedy continued, "I am going to ask where that money comes from. That isn't partisan. That isn't mean. That is basic due diligence. That is what every taxpayer has the right to expect from their elected officials." "Do you think she learned anything?" another student asked. Kenedy thought for a moment. "I think a lot of people learned something," he said. "Maybe not the lesson she wanted to teach when she walked into that hearing room, but an important one nonetheless." "What lesson is that?" the student pressed. "That passion isn't enough," Kenedy said firmly. "That moral urgency isn't enough. That you can't tweet your way through economic policy. Reality doesn't care about your feelings, or your rhetoric, or your Instagram following. It cares about the math." "And if you come to testify before the United States Senate," Kenedy added, a twinkle in his eye, "you better do your homework, because somebody might ask you to show your work." The legacy of that Wednesday morning in March was profound. The Kenedy questions, what does it cost? Who pays? What is the return? Became a new standard in Washington. Journalists started asking them more aggressively. Policy think tanks started front-loading their reports with financing sections. The cultural impact was even wider. The calculator became a symbol. "Show your math" became a shorthand for demanding substance over style. In schools, civics teachers used the hearing video as a teaching tool, not to mock AOC, but to illustrate the difference between activism and governance. Activism is about identifying problems. Governance is about solving them within the constraints of reality. And AOC herself? She evolved. She became a more effective legislator. She stopped introducing bills that were essentially press releases and started co-sponsoring legislation that could actually pass. She learned that while slogans move crowds, spreadsheets move legislation. Kenedy picked up his notes to leave the podium, but he turned back for one final thought. "Oh, and one more lesson," he said to the future lawyers and leaders in the room. "Math is real. Numbers don't care if you are a Democrat or a Republican. 2 + 2 = 4, no matter how passionately you argue that it should be 5. If you can't do the math," Kenedy said, walking off the stage, "you aren't ready to lead." The hearing room in the Hart Senate office building had been silent when AOC couldn't add up her revenue sources. Silent when she couldn't explain where $900 billion would come from. But that silence had spoken louder than any speech in congressional history. It was the sound of a generation realizing that the world is complicated, that solutions aren't free, and that sometimes the most radical thing you can do is buy a calculator and tell the truth. That was the economics lesson. When Alexandria met reality, and reality, armed with nothing but arithmetic and a Louisiana drawl, won decisively.